and welcome to our Spotlight session focused on Microsoft Entra and their new Security Service Edge, or SSE, offerings. I'm Jason Garbus, principal and founder here at Numberline Security, and as part of these ongoing Spotlight series, we like to respond to news or releases that vendors and providers put out there, dive into them a little bit, talk through them, and give our perspective on what this means to the industry. So this was pretty big news this week when Microsoft formally entered the Security Service Edge, or SSE, space with the introduction of preview of two new technologies, two new service offerings under this new, now much broader Microsoft Entra brand. So let's take a look at what this is. So Microsoft now has a whole suite of products under this Entra brand that they released about a year or so ago. Now, you can see three categories here, and we want to talk through them one by one. Our focus today are the new network access components, and we'll get to those in a minute. First thing to understand or realize and to retrain ourselves is that Azure AD is now renamed as Microsoft Entra ID. So that's something that we'll all have to get used to, and I imagine that many of us for many years will still be referring to it as Azure AD, but we're going to try to call it Microsoft Entra AD. Microsoft also has now announced the general availability of their access governance solution, Microsoft Entra ID Governance. That was preview, I believe it was last year, and now it's generally available, providing access reviews, attestations, join remover, leaver automation, and things like that. Microsoft also has a new external ID service in preview, which is not the focus for our discussion here today. Microsoft also newishly has a newish service offering called Verified ID that was released earlier this year as part of one of their developer conferences. They also have their cloud infrastructure entitlement management, or CIEM, solution called Microsoft Entra Permissions Management, and a workload identity and access management solution called Microsoft Entra Workload ID. The newest offerings, the ones that we're going to talk about today, are Microsoft Entra Internet Access, which is their secure web gateway, which is in preview, and Microsoft Entra Private Access, which is their ZTNA solution, or Zero Trust Network Access, and that's also in preview. So we're going to focus in depth on those two new offerings, talk about what it means. This is the Microsoft picture of the broader suite. So they're calling it and referring to it as their Security Service Edge, or SSE, solution. And you can see there's three main components at the bottom there. Not the zero trust principles, which I'm really happy to see there, right? Verifying explicitly access, enforcing the principle of least privilege, and assuming breach. But these three components here, Microsoft Entra Internet Access, Private Access, and Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. So obviously, this one uses a different branding, but that is their CASB solution. And TBD, I guess, on Microsoft whether it'll get rolled into the Entra brand or not, but it is their CASB offering. The picture here is important because it shows Microsoft's holistic view, and it squarely puts them into the SSE market, competing with other players that are out there, the Netscopes and the Zscalers and the Palos and many of the others who offer that solutions. And in a minute, we'll talk about what the other components of SSE are. The key here is that they're really diving into and supporting the zero trust principles that we really care about and we think are important of any user and any device with access to any app and any resource. And that's important because this starts to get to this universal policy model and a holistic policy model that we think is important. Now, there's a couple of asterisks around that, and we'll talk about that in particular around private access when we get to that. The key here is that this follows the classic, now classic, cloud-routed architecture for Security Service Edge, where Microsoft has points of presence or entry points into their network running in all of their data centers as part of their Azure cloud environment. So those are currently available around the world in certain locations, and of course they're going to grow that over time. They capture the traffic that's bound both for private applications as well as internet and SaaS applications and Microsoft 365 applications, and they apply using their Microsoft conditional access component, the filters and policies that allow organizations, allow enterprises to define which users, which groups, on which devices should be allowed to access which of these resources under which circumstances or at which time. So that's great. That's a great step in the right direction, and is exactly what we like to see for these SSE types of platforms. Now, this is a Gartner diagram, and the reason I'm bringing it up is I want to remind folks of what the elements are of SSE or SASE. So SASE is the bigger picture that Gartner put together, and essentially it's SD-WAN and some of the other wide area networks components on the left side here, plus security services. Now, Microsoft, of course, doesn't offer SD-WAN or WAN optimization or things like that, and they're not claiming to, right? They're very clearly saying we do SSE. So if you look at what SSE is, it's the secure web gateway, CASB, zero trust network access, firewall as a service, remote browser isolation, and SSL or TLS inspection. Now, Microsoft certainly has most of these, right? We talked about the secure web gateway and ZTNA that they announced today. They have their CASB already, the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. And they have browser isolation. It's not technically remote browser isolation. It's their Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. No, excuse me. It's called Microsoft Defender Application Guard. And that is their browser isolation component. And it works a little bit differently. It's not rendered in the cloud. It's rendered on the user's device in a virtual machine, and it uses Hyper-V running on Windows, on the Windows client, and the Edge browser to do that isolation. I can't comment on its technical merits, but it's a different architecture than remote browser isolation, but it is a credible offering for Microsoft to say, hey, we offer this. Now, Microsoft doesn't offer a firewall as a service, but in my opinion, that's a little bit less important and really typically falls a little bit more into the kind of the WAN or network edge service type of capabilities. So I think this is a pretty credible statement, a pretty credible portfolio by Microsoft for SSE, even though the stuff's in preview. So now let's look at the internet access piece of this. So this is a similar picture, but this is just looking at the internet access side of things. And the way it works is it relies on a client running on the user's device, and it allows the organization to set up conditional access and access policies, and it distinguishes between access to Microsoft 365 apps and other internet apps. And presumably there's good reasons for that, because obviously the M365 apps are fully under Microsoft's control, and the other ones are everything else that's running out there. So initially in this early preview, the solution is a little bit limited. It only provides support for the Windows client right now, and only provides access controls into Microsoft 365 apps. Now, we see their vision here. We know it's going to change. So over the course of 2023, they are promising to support other client operating systems and other applications, and we fully expect them to deliver on that. It makes perfect sense. The private access solution is similar picture, uses the same client running on the client device, and it controls the traffic that goes into corporate managed applications. Those applications can be on premises, running the traditional data centers, or they can be running in any cloud environment. And you can see up there, of course, they fully support the major cloud providers. The way it works is follows the same architecture that you can expect and have seen from other major SSE providers. So essentially, there's a connector that runs on premises or in the tenant, the customer's tenant in a cloud environment, and that establishes an outbound IPsec tunnel to a local or the nearest point of presence for the global cloud, Microsoft cloud. So no inbound connections. These are outbound connections from the corporate network. Oops. And that traffic is then tunneled from the user's device through the cloud. So it's a cloud routed model to the target resource here. The nice thing about this is that they do promise to support not just web apps, but in fact, any TCP application, and support for UDP is on the roadmap. So that's going to allow them to support legacy application protocols and other types of applications, or even system services like something like SMB, for example, that that many enterprises have. Now, let's go ahead and dive into the documentation on some of these. Okay, let's take a look at some of the documentation and website assets that Microsoft has. So this is the actual blog posting, and I recommend reading this. And I will have posted the links in the supporting blog for this video, so you can find them. So this blog talks about in some detail what they've announced and where they're going with the Entra product family. In particular, they talk about internet access and private access, both being in preview and where they are. So this is a good launching point. They have the same picture that we talked through. They also talk about some of the rebranding, changes to the tiers, and then some of the other services that we're not talking about today, but are worth looking at if there's something that you're interested in around Microsoft Entra ID protection, access governance with the ID governance solution, et cetera. So let's talk about a little bit more detail. First up, the Internet Access preview. So this site also is worth looking at. And what they do is they talk about controlling access to internet-bound applications. Initially, Microsoft 365, and it does support for universal, what they call universal conditional access, basically applying the conditional access capabilities. And we'll look at the documentation for that momentarily to the internet-bound resources. And this is great, right? This is a capability that enterprises really need in zero trust solutions, is tying together device management, device context, along with identity context, and then applying those in real time or near real time as the user is attempting to access a resource. And that's kind of the crux of zero trust, is having the ability to have these dynamic policies. And Microsoft has a really nice suite of things taken together that can do this. Looking at the private access preview site, again, some good details on here. They talk about how they're doing this. They're talking about replacement for VPNs, obviously. They're talking about enforcing multi-factor authentication on legacy protocols. Now, the video for this is not that super exciting because it's someone going through a file share. But what is interesting about this is you'll see that this is not a web protocol, right? This is using SMB. And in the middle of trying to access SMB, they're prompted for a multi-factor authentication. The screenshot really doesn't do it justice, but all of us have logged in with Microsoft, either an app or a push OTP or something like that. And it's essentially showing, hey, I'm accessing something that isn't a web protocol, but I'm still enforcing and using this modern authentication mechanism for it. And that's great. That's something that organizations really need. And they also have what they call adaptive per app access, and that's essentially taking this conditional access and applying it to network level access, which is terrific. It's really, again, one of the core tenets of zero trust is taking network access and having enforcement points at the application layer. And because now in this world of private access, Microsoft has a client on the user device and they're tunneling the traffic, they're inline, they have an inline enforcement point. Now, keep in mind that this is a remote access solution only. It's not, because of the way it's architected, because the traffic is, if I can find it real quick, routed through the Microsoft cloud. It's not something that is going to work today for on-premises users accessing on-premises applications. So that's something to be aware of, and potentially is going to be a roadmap item for Microsoft. So here is the documentation on it. Now, it's a little bit confusing because you can see in the documentation they refer to it as global secure access, and obviously that branding is a little bit different. It feels like it's one turn of the crank behind, if I can find the picture here, one turn of the crank behind on the branding called Microsoft Entra Private Access, or I should say Microsoft Entra SSE. But clearly it's the same set of capabilities here that has private access and internet access, even though it's referred to a little bit differently here as, I got to find the right picture, Microsoft SSE. So the documentation, of course, is traditional Microsoft documentation, very comprehensive, and there's a lot of substance here. The key things I think to understand are, if I can find the right link here, they talk about internet access and private access, and for each of these, they talk about how to go through it. I really wanted to talk about private access in particular, and if I can find the right thing here. Yes. First of all, I wanted to talk about conditional access. So they call this thing universal conditional access. And it's essentially a way of saying, we've got this capability called Microsoft Conditional Access that's been around for a number of years. And they're now extending it to beyond the authentication level or the authentication trigger that they've had for a number of years to now being able to apply to inline access for both internet access, internet applications, as well as private applications. That's a pretty big advance for Microsoft. So conditional access policies, there's a lot of depth to them, and they allow you to look in and configure based on things like user group membership, device policy, or device posture checks, et cetera. So that's definitely worth looking at. If we look at the private access components here, they separate the policy model for private access into what they call quick access and global secure access, or as private application. So it's basically just a grouping of saying, here's my default, let's call it baseline or birthright, so to speak, network access that everyone has. So this would be something like on-premises DNS or file shares or whatever it is that you want everyone to have access to. And then you have private applications, which are essentially separate groups or separate segments of your user base that for which you want to define specific applications. Same policy model applies. It's just a question of how you want to slice and dice it. And then in there, what you're doing is you're basically saying, okay, I want to define a certain set of IP addresses or fully qualified domain names. And then in here, I want to control access to that. And then there's obviously an information model around connector groups and policies and things like that, application segments. And the details aren't important for what we're talking about, but what is important is that you can specify it either by IP address or by FQDN. You can also define what port it is, and that's important here. And this is, I think this table here is a little bit misleading because they're saying, hey, here's most popular ports, but it really looks like, as far as I can tell, that it supports any TCP port. So if you have some other application or a legacy protocol, or you're using something entirely different, you could use it for that, as long as supported over TCP. Conditional access, yes. So this is kind of the crux of it, where in here you can define, this is a screenshot I wanted to show, things such as, hey, I want to make sure that for this particular set of applications or application group that these conditions apply. In this case, it's under the quick access group, but it could be under the private access as well. And this is where you can do things like, I want to require multi-factor authentication, or I want my device to be tagged as compliant for my organization's specific device posture check, or I want it to be joined to Azure AD, or what we now know as Entra ID, et cetera. So this is really the interesting area where now organizations can use this whole Microsoft ecosystem to define and control the conditions under which a given device should or shouldn't be allowed to access private applications. So that is what I really wanted to cover in this video. I think it's really interesting news. Microsoft obviously put a lot of effort into building this out, and I'm looking forward to getting firsthand experience using this, as well as feedback from enterprises as they start to use it. And I think it's a great advance for the industry, and I think it's going to represent an even further acceleration of the adoption of zero trust principles as we move into this world and get away from the bad old days of VPNs running on the internet, exposing open ports and being attacked, and moving to a much more secure and zero trust world. Thank you. I hope this was useful. Have a great day.